Hello and welcome to the Dementia Fiction Festival, the Gala reading this evening. I'm Marjorie Lotfy. I'm a poet and involved in all kinds of different parts of our literature world, but we're joined tonight by four writers who write regularly, I would say, about dementia and all the things that involves. And I'm going to ask them to wave at you. You'll hear from them all a lot later this evening. The first will be Sarah Hesketh, who's here with us this evening. Niamh McCabe, Linda Tavakoli, and Anna Wharton. So thank you all. So tonight, the format for tonight's event is that we're going to just take turns round the room, as it were, this digital space. And we're going to hear from each of them in turn, who are going to do us a reading, which is terrific, and answer the odd question at the end of the reading. And then we'll open it up into a discussion for us to have, but also for your questions and comments, which I'm hoping that you'll feed in, and we can weave those through our own conversations and into the end of the evening. And once we're finished chatting, we'll make sure that there aren't any further questions from you before we hand it over to Jan to finish off. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Sarah, who's going to take over and talk us through her reading. Sarah Hesketh is a writer and an editor. In 2013, she was a poet in residence with Age Concern, working with elderly people with dementia. And in 2014, she published The Hard Word Box by Penned in the Margins, a collection of poems and interviews inspired by this experience. She's the editor of the Emma Press anthology of poems about age, and she currently lives in London and works as the managing editor for Modern Poetry and Translation magazine. Hello and welcome, Sarah.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thanks for being with us. So you're going to kick us off with a reading in the next minute or so, and then I'll ask you a couple of questions before we move on, just to break up the readings. So I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thank you. So it is a real pleasure to be able to join you this evening for this Gala reading. I've managed to dip in and out of some of the events across the past 2 days, and it's been an absolutely amazing program. I've just been blown away by kind of just the level of engagement and interest of the speakers. So it feels like a really long time ago that I actually did this kind of work. So kind of coming back to this book has been kind of an exercise almost in nostalgia for me. It's quite an odd one. But as you say, I spent a period of almost a year going in and out of the same care home in Lancashire and Preston, spending time with the residents. And I think it's kind of important to know that we weren't kind of sent in there to kind of work as art therapists or necessarily sort of work with participants, although for them to produce work, we were sent in as practicing artists. And I kind of think we could probably talk more about how approaches have changed later. But it was sort of quite a revolutionary idea at the time that we kind of might go in and just think about our own work rather than, and how we might kind of represent what we had experienced. And that's not to say that the process was not collaborative, because obviously it was, and we were very much encouraged to think of it that way. But it was less about us kind of bringing therapeutic benefits. And the idea was more that by producing high quality art in different art forms in this particular setting, we could help to highlight to the rest of the world. It would almost be an act of advocacy, what we were doing, and activism. So that's kind of the context. And I'm just going to read, I think, maybe 4 poems. And sort of the first thing that I really got obsessed with when I was working at Elsie Finney House were the care plans. So a care plan, when someone goes into a care setting, they work with the staff there to produce a care plan. And they kind of vary in format, but essentially they're a sort of mini biography of the person who is moving into that care setting. And it's sort of, do they like to wear pajamas or a nightie at night? Do they drink tea or coffee? You know, what kind of sort of hobbies might they have had? What kind of job did they have? And the idea is that these documents are kind of continually updated, and the staff can use them to help work with those particular people, and kind of sort of have a snapshot that they can very quickly build a relationship. And what I found actually was that the kind of care plans that I was looking at had been produced when that person first moved into care, but they hadn't necessarily always been updated, or they didn't necessarily bear that much resemblance to the person who was sat in front of me by the time they'd been kind of in care for kind of 5 years or whatever it might have been. So there was a particular woman called Doreen that I worked with who was kind of tiny. She was only about 4'10", and she was very spiky. And on my first day there, a member of staff actually said, "Look out for that one. She's a bit of a bitch," which was kind of an amazing thing to be confronted with in the first place. But I won't say that he was totally wrong, but I kind of came to love her for it. She was very angry. And her own daughter-in-law, who came very regularly to visit her, actually said, "This is not the dementia. She's always been like this." She was kind of fascinating. She'd been married 3 times. She'd kind of mourned them all for a fixed period and then kind of moved on. So the first poem I'm going to read is called Doreen. And what it is basically is a cut-up between her care plan and all of the words that Doreen actually said to me whilst I was visiting over the 12 months. It's called Doreen. Doreen is a widow. Doreen has 1 son and a daughter-in-law in the Preston area. Doreen loves flowers. Doreen loved horrible, 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 horrible gardening and was always happy when spending time in the garden. Doreen likes, "I didn't come back, you came back," collie dogs, you and that woman, and looking at pictures of them. Doreen can be quite unhappy when assisted with personal care. Doreen likes going into the garden. Doreen sometimes likes the "shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up" sing along. Doreen, "Don't come any nearer, you're past it now," likes her own space and to be left alone sometimes. Doreen doesn't like to be fussed. Doreen is not tactile. Doreen used to make all her own clothes, mucky, mucky, mucky people. As she was so petite, she was never able to find things to fit. Doreen has a good sense of humour. Doreen can be a bit rude sometimes. Be good, because we have no more, but staff help her with this. Doreen's life achievement, awaiting information. Doreen does not. That's horrible, disgusting, no, I don't like that. Mobilise. I think the other thing that kind of became most apparent to me whilst I was there was what a strange physical environment a residential care home can be. And that is often through no fault of anybody. It's just that you have a lot of people who are quite confused, kind of wandering around the place, often depositing objects in places that they shouldn't be. There were spoons everywhere. Everywhere you went, you just found a spoon because it was one of the few things that people had access to. But one of the rooms in the home was given over to what they called the nursery. And it was a very odd room because it was where they kept a set of dolls and bears and sort of baby equipment. And there is, anyone who's worked in sort of dementia care might know about something called doll therapy. And in kind of highly managed contexts, there is some evidence that especially older women who have had children get actually quite a lot of enjoyment and comfort from caring for potentially bears and dolls and sort of treating them almost as real babies, as real children. But it's got to be highly supervised and it's got to be done with the right people. And where I was, unfortunately, a lot of the time sort of women were just left to kind of go in and out of this nursery room by themselves and kind of pick up the dolls and the bears. And one day there was one woman who was very upset because her doll had been found with its head shoved down a banister and, you know, she thought it was a real baby. So there were kind of sort of humorous moments and kind of awful moments in this use. And I went in with a photographer one day who was recording the project, and we went in there and there were a couple of bears sat in a chair and they had this kind of grubby stains around their mouths that was quite wet, and we realized someone had actually been trying to give them real cups of tea and coffee. And I thought, God, if these bears and dolls could actually talk and give us what their point of view of what it's like to be a resident here. So this poem is called Interview with the Bears. No, of course, this isn't what we had in mind at all. The smells couldn't be more different here to the clean fruit of a child's head. They rumple their faces over our beds. Today, we're the wrong kind of children. Tomorrow, we're like answers in their hands, bright, furry sentences. It's best not to get too attached, to ignore the sudden smile in the corridor or the hug that suggests, for once, you might be exactly what they were looking for. What remains are the stains, the grungy kisses, the pressure of a teacup around our mouths, the way they pulled us apart and fingered our innards endlessly with joy, like we were snow. And the third poem I'm going to read, again, was kind of based on the physicality of the place. So care home furniture always looks very odd. These slightly kind of weird maroon and yellow colours. And actually kind of one of the academics we were working with on the project explained that really kind of towards the end, the kind of colours that people can see change, and actually the very last colour to go is red. And so actually it could be quite helpful to have red furniture in a care home because it's easier for people to see, and towards the end of their life it can be the only colour that they can really see. So this poem is called Into the White. They say the colour of finally is red. The dinner plate, the walls, the chairs are all saying, look, you live by emergency. Everything is so bald heart, too much muscle in the sound of thinking. All we want is to be allowed to be gone, to fall from this dark like brushed white chalk. And I'm just going to finish with the title poem of the book, which is The Hard Words. And I think this is something that has come up in the festival in the past 2 days, and which we might talk about more later. It's just that kind of sense of responsibility, the ethics of what it is that you're doing when you're working in dementia care, and the kind of desire to not exploit anybody, to bear in mind those power dynamics. And there were a lot of sort of people who I would talk to about the project, and they go, oh, how interesting, kind of, isn't it lovely how the words of people with dementia are like poetry? And I would sort of go, well, potentially, but also they might just be trying to say they want to go to the toilet, kind of let's not romanticize what we're kind of hearing. You've got to be very careful about that particular stance, I think. And yes, often it can read like poetry and it can look beautiful, but also you've got to bear in mind these are just people who are trying to communicate, and those communications could be really basic needs that they have. So that was kind of the message I wanted to give overall with the book, I think, that sense of ethical responsibility. And so this poem is called The Hard Words. Look, let's be clear. Don't imagine there is anybody here who enjoys dribbling poetry. If you think we're holding stars on our tongues, that's your eyes want testing. If you hear music when we grunt, you haven't understood exactly what it is we needed to say. You might enjoy the ruins of our grammar, the way we chew up our nouns to song. It's not your hand that's getting thinner on the blanket. Please, don't ask us to speak the hard words all at once. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that beautiful reading, and for all the introductions around it as well, kind of contextualizing it. I could see lots of us nodding, and I'm sure lots of your listeners are nodding too. I just want to ask you a quick question about one of the things you said at the beginning, which is that idea when you went into the home that you weren't there for the art therapy. And I wondered if you felt, because there's such a gap between the subject matter of what you're writing about and you coming into this place, was your role just, one of the words you used was to record it, as a kind of act of, how did you do that? Was it, did you feel that you weren't able to, because as poets, we often have to put something into it. It's not a photograph, and as you said, there was a photographer. So how did you approach that? That idea of recording what you were seeing, or was it hard to stay away from the voice of the bears or the other things?
Yeah, it was a really hard balance to strike. And I think one of the great things about the project is that it was a completely open brief. So, and that was kind of quite scary for, I think, kind of the funders and the organisers, because they really didn't know what we were going to come out with, and neither did we until the end of it. But I think the thing that became apparent was that, it was about finding a balance between personal practice and also bearing witness. Bearing witness I'm less comfortable with than the idea of advocacy, because I think bearing witness implies a sort of passive recording of other people's experiences, where I felt much more that it was my job to kind of advocate for change, actually, and to kind of say, look, no, this is, I'm not just presenting you with what I've seen. I think actually changes need to happen, so that it wasn't just a case of going in, recording what I had done, and then kind of walking away again and kind of presenting it. There needed to be a kind of slightly longer term engagement. And all of the carers and staff that I spoke to felt very unheard. And one of the kind of the best responses I had from one of the care staff was, she went, I didn't even finish school. I can't write a book about this. You go out there and you tell people what it's really like. So that kind of gave me a sort of permission and a motivation.
Yeah, and it's something I want us to all talk about when we're done with the reading, because I think that idea of taking on voices is a hot one, and a difficult one in other contexts, but I think this is a special one. So, were you tempted by the stories of the people that were the people living with dementia as well? Because, and then were you unsure of the stories that you were getting? How do you take them as read or take them as given? Because quite often, as you said, they change, people change.
Yeah, so actually the bulk, there's a lot of kind of poems in this book, but actually the kind of bulk of the pages are a series of interviews, kind of edited interviews that I did with George, who was one of the residents. He was kind of one of the more slightly lucid, although some of his interview is kind of amazing when he starts talking about carrying a gun and kind of working for a bookie firm and kind of, so, and it's kind of, well, did he, or did he just see it on TV? And you don't know, but it kind of doesn't matter, right? Because that's what he said. And so I didn't attempt to edit or change, anything that anybody told me. And there's also one of the other long interviews was actually with the sister of one of the residents who subsequently died whilst I was there as well. And so there is, I think the book is that balance between my own impressions and my own practice, and actually putting their words down on the page as well, so that they're speaking for themselves in some cases. So it's not me attempting to reform or ventriloquize their stories. They're actually there and they're speaking in the text themselves with their own words.
Yeah, and I think we see that beautifully in your Doreen poem, because, we get the bits that may have been true at one point, or certainly were written down as truth by someone, and then her, actual words as well. And although you can't see them out there, they're in all caps. So it's really clear the kind of force with which she's saying them. So yeah, that kind of juxtaposition really comes through there. Okay, I'm going to leave that because we've got three others to get through, and then we'll come back together because I'm sure you all have similar things to pitch in on that. So we're going to move to Neve, if that's okay. I'm going to introduce you, tell you a little bit about her, and then I'll pass over to her. So Neve McCabe is a Leitrim-based visual artist and an award-winning writer, published in many, many journals and anthologies, and I'm going to tell you a few of them, but not all of them. The Stinging Fly, Narrative, Dyslexia, No Alibis Press, Still Words, Turning, Southward, the Irish Independent, and the list goes on. We're really pleased to have her here today with us and going to do this reading for us. So I'm going to pass over to you, Neve, and then I'll come back and ask you a couple of questions as well.
Thank you, Marjorie. It's really lovely to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this. My dad, Jim, died just this time last year, and Dad was diagnosed with dementia 12 years before he died. So he lived with dementia for 12 years, which is quite amazing. And about 2 or 3 years after he was diagnosed, he lost his ability to walk. And shortly after that, he lost his ability to talk. So my dad was a very physically and mentally active man. So this was a real tightening of his experience, and it was really painful to watch him. But what was amazing was how well he coped, and how, as his world got smaller, how much more important each tiny thing and each tiny achievement became for him as he very positively struggled to stay on top of things. And one event or one happening that really struck me and that caused me to write a story about it was when his words were reduced to just one word, the word yes. So yes became all Dad said. So either it was a silence, maybe a nod of the head, or else it was yes. And, you know, that's a tiny word. It's a very binary word, but it somehow, you know, it would always work, whatever it is he was saying. And I suppose just started putting so much emphasis for myself on that one word and the positivity of that word. I was moved to write a story. I called my story La La La. So I wrote this story while he was still alive and still, you know, communicating in that way. And I suppose my experience of dementia is how, you know, how much there can still be behind those tiny little things, those tiny little actions, and how as his loved ones, we all grasped all those tiny opportunities for that link still with our dad and my mum Kay, her husband. So before I read my excerpt, I'll say, so this story is called La La La. It's a story that narrates the changing and enduring relationship between an elderly mother and her son as they navigate together and individually her slow decline through dementia, because it is a decline. Nobody wants to go that way. This particular excerpt takes place in a nursing home, but in this story, as was the case with my dad, the character, the elderly woman in this story, doesn't live in a nursing home, but occasionally is sent off to, that sounds terrible, sent off, but anyway, occasionally is offered respite she's brought to the nursing home for respite or to stay for 2 or 3 weeks, but it is a respite for her family to try and gather themselves for a bit while she's away. So, and her son comes to visit her there. So I'm just going to go ahead and read my excerpt from La La La. Usually he drops by, turning up at lunchtime to feed her. He had not been so vigilant on her very first day, arriving at the ward to find her bereft, chin covered in mashed food, staring at the fork still clutched in her strong hand. He had stood looking at his sunken mother, lousy guilt soldered an indelible mark on him as he tut-tutted and changed her sodden paper bib. Her form had been an erratic lag, folding and unfolding. Sometimes she would remember how to eat. Sometimes she wouldn't and would just sit there, head back, mouth open like a nestling. Sometimes she would start off remembering, then forget. Sometimes the reverse happened, and she would try to wrestle the fork back off him, scowling with the bearing of an old tabby cat. He would feed her or watch her try to feed herself. He would warble merrily about anything that came to mind, always in the present. The chart music on the radio, the wheelchair-accessible taxis ramping up and down, the warmth of his hand in hers, the earth smell of parsnips, the sweetness of the yogurt used to camouflage her pills. She had recently begun to crunch through them rather than swallow them whole. He thought the taste must be insufferable, whether she could name it or not. Sometimes she would focus on one of the other elderly women in the ward, as if she had just noticed them. Slowly she would raise her arm and point. Was she hoping that by singling out this patient, all would become clear? He would mumble an apology and try to distract her with photos on his phone, the same ones he had enthused over the day before. But she would hold fast, ignoring the phone lifted up to her, gazing just above it. She would stare hard-mouthed at her neighbour on the other side, after a period of time, she would end the siege with a burst of schoolgirl laughter, as if one of them had got the joke. He would turn his back to hide his smile, winking at his mother. If one of us goes to war, all of us go to war. After lunch, he would wheel her out of the ward. They would trundle past the nurse's station, past the small tea shop stocked with a collection of individually wrapped biscuits. They would emerge into the daylight and head for a patch of green beyond the car park, where he would name the trees and the birds for her. He no longer gave her flowers to inspect because once, when he had turned around to face her after adjusting her wheelchair brakes, he had spotted the remains of a primrose, dangling dainty from her mouth, her thin jaws rolling slow like a cow at cud. Had he seen a sparse eyebrow rise as she stared through him? One afternoon, they lingered beneath an oak at the car park's edge. He fell into silence, listening. Cars, traffic lights bleeping, the main entrance doors sliding open and shut for no one. Behind all of it, a songbird. He allowed the tenuous little trill to just be, without feeling the need to identify the bird. Her eyes were closed. Was she sleeping, or had she forgotten to open them? What's the difference? He closed his own and leaned against her. The bird offered its air, ending each fragile verse with a melodic question mark, waiting, then repeating the process. Soon he heard a soft, low sound start at his side. He watched his mother purse her lips and try to mimic the bird call. She whistled, imitating the sound almost flawlessly, and waited. The response came after a pause, the bird returning the song, with the question mark still at the end. Do you hear me? Yes, I hear you. Do you hear me? Back and forth the exchange went between woman and bird, never deviating from the short tune, until the pauses between them lengthened, and finally, the conversation expired. They wove back over the crumbling tarmac, in through the sliding doors and down to her ward. Dreading that moment when he'd feel her bewildered stare follow him as he walked away, he had devised a new leaving process. Now, Ma, he would say, would you like to listen to some music after our walk? I'll bet you're tired and would love to close your eyes and listen to some music on the headphones. I brought your CD of Vaughan Williams. Look, The Lark Ascending. You like this, Ma, remember? Remember the lark ascending. Remember Alauda arvensis, the skylark. And the woodlark, Ma, the woodlark, Lullula arborea. She would eye her surroundings, gape at him, her jaw hanging. We're back here at your bed, Ma, in the ward, and you must be well tired. So I'm going to leave you be for a wee while. You rest and listen to your Vaughan Williams. Wait till you hear, you like this. He shuttered the headphones over her ears, settled his palm over her eyes. He could hear the opening strains of the spiraling violin, the music and impression of a lark's unbroken song. The bird rises, circling high into the air until it is just a flickering dot in the sky, its quavering vocalization still clear as a glass chime. He felt her flutter and then close her eyelids behind his hand. He left before she opened them again, knowing that when she did, she would have forgotten he was ever there. Thank you.
Thank you
That's
for
my
that
piece.
recording, Niamh. I have to say that image of her singing to the bird, or the conversation with the bird, has stuck with me for days. So thank you for that. You know, it sounds a really strange thing to say in a reading, in a festival reading about dementia, but it felt to me that there were so many moments of positivity in that story, you know, and when you were talking about your family and your dad, your father being positive, wondered if you were setting out to do that on purpose. You know, there's that kind of, they almost escape, you know, and then there's these images of trees and birds and somehow almost a reduction of the things that we expect and making way for something positive. I mean, I don't know if you were setting out to do that or trying to create a way for others to see it in that way, but does that strike a chord with you? Because for me, that's what it felt like. You know, it felt like
it certainly does. Yeah, it certainly does, Marjorie. I would have, well, 12 years was a long time to live with dementia. So, and it was a slow decline. So my dad very much tried to, you know, to embrace all of his capabilities up to the very last. Everything he was given, even when it was reduced to a minuscule link with life and his family, he used it to the end. And I found a real positivity in that, and you know, it's all that you have. So you have to, and there's a joy in recognizing that, and that, you know, those moments. My dad was very keen on birdsong and trees, and so the story I wrote is very much based on my experience with him and having him as a father. And these are things he would do. That, you know, he didn't lose his ability to, I suppose you could say, communicate then, you know, with birds. Like that's the way he would have described it when he was still able to speak. He'd be, you know, he would say he was talking to the birds, and he continued when he was no longer able to talk to us. You know, we would wheel his wheelchair out into the garden, and he would light up. He would hear the birds, and he would whistle back to them. And it's something that I found joyous, because I thought, well, there's loss. You know, one aspect of his life is going down. There's another aspect that's been ramped up, and that's you know, this keen interest in, I heard this sound and I'm going to respond to it. I found huge positivity in that, and also humor. I mean, you know, I have in that little excerpt I read to you. I have that scene where, you know, where the elderly woman is kind of laughing at these other patients in the ward, and then her son sort of, you know, winks at her. And I found that, you know, that way of yourself and making fun of the daft things that happen. I found that really useful too, to navigate the whole, you know, living with dementia situation.
Yeah, and the writing of the son as well. He's full of ideas, you know, which I, you know, partly think if that you were in that situation, you'd be reading thinking, well, that's a great way to, even the ending, you know, is a really lovely way of thinking, oh, that's a good way of leaving someone in that scenario. So I know in my day job, I run Open Book, which is a charity that reads with lots of individuals living with dementia. And you're right, song is one of the last things, sound, song, poetry at that age group. Lots of people, dementia strikes people of all ages, but certainly the elderly group in Scotland in particular were forced to memorize poetry. So if you bring it in, it's remarkable. You know, people who haven't spoken in ages, who wouldn't recognize family members, can still recite, you know, certain poems, certain songs. So yeah, it is definitely one of the last things to go. But I love the way that you bring that into the story. I'm going to keep us moving because we've got 2 more readings to go and I want to make room for us to chat. So thank you, Niamh. I'm going to move on and we'll come back to Linda. You're up next in the studio. So you're with us. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you fine.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm going to introduce you, and then I'm going to hand you over to read a little bit for us, and then we'll chat quickly. So Linda Tabacoli has written widely about the subject of aging and its effect on her family. Her dementia-related poetry and prose have featured in the Irish Times and broadcast on BBC Radio Ulster and RTE. Her debut poetry collection, The Boiling Point for Jam, contains poems that she hopes will offer insight into dementia and its many personal challenges. Thanks for joining us, Linda. We're looking forward to hearing you read your poems.
Thank you, Marjorie, and thank you for inviting me this evening. I'm very much looking forward to hearing everyone speaking. My experience of dementia, I suppose, is threefold, in that my dad had dementia, multi-infarct dementia. My maternal aunt was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and my mother, I suppose, she didn't have a diagnosis of dementia, but I would explain her condition as basically the frailty of aging. I've written journalistic pieces about dementia. I've written fictional pieces about dementia, and eventually I wrote poetry, because with the journalistic pieces, I started further away in terms of the emotions of things. And with the fiction, it got a little bit closer. And the poetry is very much coming from a personal angle with me. So that's where my poetry comes from. I'm going to read 4 poems, if that's okay. And I'll give a short introduction for each one, just to put the picture in place. The first poem is about my mother, and it's about what you were speaking about earlier on, about having a voice, and maybe we can talk about that a bit later. Not only just having a voice with writing, but having a voice for another person. And the situation that happened in this poem was about me having the difficulty of actually having a voice for my mother when I thought that she couldn't speak for herself in a certain situation. She was a very kind woman, my mom, and she grew up in a generation that was very deferential to professionals like doctors and dentists, etc. So the situation in this poem actually did happen to me, and the first poem is called A Village Practice. A Village Practice. I find him attractive in that young and self-assured dentist kind of way. And I imagine in an earlier life, there could have been a spark of something there. My mother waits in his chair, her brittle mouth only small. I am told to sit in the corner, and I do, examining the cleanliness of the room, pondering how it cloys in the disinfecting spaces between us. He prizes apart her poor jaw, chooses a drill. The stickered soles of my mother's shoes twitch with some invisible electric shock, but the rest of her is numb, except her mouth, which is not. I am her voice and the palliative care of her crumbling teeth, yet I am reticent. It does not do to question authority, regardless of age. And pain relief, I ask. The request an unforeseen tsunami across the room, a sudden game of truth or dare. She doesn't need it. She does. She doesn't. I cannot see my mother's eyes, but imagine them sealed, blanking out the embarrassment of my irreverence in this community where people talk. She does. And his slender fingers finally find a syringe. In the waiting room, muted exchanges churn around the lateness of the milking, or how the silage has seen 2 cuts already the year. We shuffle home wordless. I want her to be proud of me for standing up for her, but worry that I went too far. So she makes the tea, her bent shoulders stiff in concentration. Good girl, she says. Good girl. The second poem is also about my mom. Sorry. And my mother was a great recycler of everything. And we knew that she saved items for reuse way before it was popular. But we didn't really know until after she died just how much she hoarded away. So this is where this poem has come from. It's called Kitchen Comforts. Resistance hugs the small kitchen, hiding secrets amongst gloomy cupboard space, post-war austerity brooding on strange shelves. Empty jars wheedle their glass weight into the wood, its protest stifled only by the hum of a fridge, a magic fridge procreating eggs by the dozen, their longevity evidenced only by an absence of feathers. Plastic bags, like artificial flower heads, scrunch in hidden corners, anticipating usefulness. Receptacles for ashes and potato skins, swarf from box hedges, odd bits of wool waiting for the charity shop. An Easter cactus prospers on a sill, heedless of the pills that leave their telltale tips above the parched soil where she drove them in. This is the place she planned her day, where through a kitchen window, the dull reminders of her life still resonated in the ordinary. A rose she'd slipped, blushing the oil tank in summer. The remnants of a forgotten meal, animal fodder on the lawn. Nothing went to waste, not even the bird song wakening her at dawn that somehow hummed upon her lips for the remainder of the day. So my mom's sister, my maternal aunt, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she had a complete and utter belief in her religious beliefs. In other words, that heaven was waiting for her when she died. And consequently, that seemed to for her to have total acceptance for her condition. And I always thought that it was a lot more difficult for me to accept her Alzheimer's than it actually was for her. And this is a poem. It's called Is This What I Do? On a corridor of fresh painted magnolia, sunbeams stroke from Velux windows onto freckled carpets, while a television talks too loudly to itself in someone's room. I find you sleeping, head sagged as on a mist-hung coat hanger, hair just brushed, still full of wartime curls, a legacy that did not pass itself to me. I say your name, see the reluctant wakening of your eyes, the disappointment you had not slept your way to heaven. You have told me this before. Today we talk of blue dresses and funerals, and how you love my coat, and how you love my coat, the colour redolent of something already scudding out of view. You ask me now if this is what you do. Just sit and wait and sit. The resignation in your voice, the hardest thing for me to bear. For in this room, that thief of time has measured out its false remembrance in the ticking of a clock. As the past becomes the present, and the present loiters somewhere in the past. And my last poem is the very opposite, actually, of what I experienced with my maternal aunt, was with my dad, who had multi-infarct dementia. And my dad recognized the injustice of the hand that he had been dealt with in his final years. So there was a clarity of thought with my dad that was actually very difficult sometimes. And it goes back actually to what Sarah was talking about earlier on about the comfort objects that the dementia patients can have. And my dad for some time was in, it wasn't an EMI unit, but it was a unit in a hospital. And we used to visit him there in the secure unit. And there was a lady who went round with the doll and her baby, and it was a real comfort to her. And I thought this was a great idea. I wouldn't get my dad a doll, but I would get him a dog, a stuffed dog, because he'd always had collie dogs. And I thought this was a really good idea. But as Sarah has alluded to earlier, it's not always a good idea. And this is where this poem came from. It's called Dead Dog. In a unit for the mentally infirm, I offer you my love in the form of a dog so lifelike you expect its tail to wag or its soft muzzle to crinkle into smiles. It's a collie, a she, a daisy dog to give comfort when your night walls are soured by the demented and God has forgotten the numbered password at your door. I have seen the woman with her baby many times, its doll head bobbing on her ribs, the lullaby that sings upon her tongue, a comfort only to the bogus child immured within those skinned and skinny limbs. She walks the ward, oblivious to all but what contentment comes before the longer shreds of darkness that will swallow up her memory whole. So I tender you my good intent. The spurious gift, I think, will link an alien present with the familiar past. But even then, with all that has been lost to you, you recognize its falsity. That's a dead dog, you say. The words raged from that part of you, still holding on and holding on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those beautiful poems. And the question that came to me when I read, I was lucky I had access to the poems ahead of time. And the thing that really struck me, maybe that some slightly differently, was that question of voice. You know, I think maybe you've taken them on in a different way. When you went set about writing the poems, did they just come, or were you worried about taking on the voice, or was it just because they were such close family members, you were okay about getting into them in a way? Does that make sense? You know, kind of speaking for them in a way.
I think because I gravitated from the factual pieces that I'd written and then graduated through that to the fictional. When I actually arrived at the poetry, the voice was sort of natural for me to take on, and I felt, because I had the three members of the family dealing with dementia in different ways and could, you know, spend a long time with each of those members of the family as they progressed through their different illnesses, it wasn't a big challenge for me to write those words down. I suppose the biggest challenge for me was how other people would react to it, because people quite often, I mean, in my book, the first half dozen poems are dementia poems, but the rest is also Middle Eastern poems, etc., and other poems. But I write from a very personal, very honest angle. And sometimes I do worry if I've gone too far. Like, you know, if my mother would worry, have I gone too far here? Why are you having this very sort of honest voice? But I think it's the only way that I can write, and it's the only way that I think that I can communicate those feelings with and connecting with an audience.
Yeah. I think it's something we should talk about all things we do too in terms of advocacy. So I think it's one of the things we all do in terms of advocacy is putting those voices out there, but that comes with a lot of questions. So I want to come back to you, Linda, and to everyone on that question in a minute, but I want to make sure we get to Anna next. So we'll come back to you in a minute. Linda, thanks.
Thank you.
I'm going to introduce Anna, and we'll have the last reading of the night, and then we'll get into cracking into conversation amongst ourselves about the subjects tackled. If you've got questions out there, please send them to us or put them in the chat so that we'll be able to see them when we're finished. So, Anna, last but not least, thanks for joining us. Anna has been a print and broadcast journalist for more than 20 years, writing for newspapers including The Times, The Guardian, The Sunday Times Magazine, Grazia, and Red. She was formerly an executive editor at the Daily Mail. She's also ghostwritten 5 memoirs, including the Sunday Times bestseller Somebody I Used to Know by Wendy Mitchell and the Orwell Prize long-listed Cut, One Woman's Fight Against FGM in Britain Today by Hibu Warder. She has an MA in creative writing from the University of East Anglia, and her debut novel, The Imposter, was published in April 2021. Hannah and Wendy's second book, What I Wish People Knew About Dementia, will be published in January 2022. So not long to go. Welcome, Anna. I'm going to hand over to you for our last reading.
Thanks so much. I feel really lucky this evening because I've just been able to sit here for nearly an hour and listen to all of your work. It's been so nice. I've really, really enjoyed it. Everything that you all are writing and working on is just so fascinating. I thought, because the piece that I'm going to read is really short, so I thought maybe I would just tell you a little bit about how I went from my non-fiction writing to fiction, because I think it's quite an interesting story.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so the non-fiction came first because I met Wendy in 2016, and she'd been diagnosed with dementia 2 years before, and my father had vascular dementia, and he died more than 20 years ago. And I came across a video on Facebook of Wendy speaking about what it's like to live with dementia, and I kind of scrolled past and thought, I don't really want to know that. And then, you know, as a writer, you kind of think, well, then there's something there you do need to know if you want to avoid that subject. So I had a look, and I found what Wendy was saying super interesting. And so I contacted her and asked her if she considered writing a book. And that's how we came to Write Somebody I Used to Know. And then after that, I had been writing my own novel for, I think I started in 2014. So I've been writing it for a couple of years. And by the time Wendy's book was published, I'd been writing it for 3 years. But I kept putting down my own work to go somebody else's different memoirs. And I was really struggling with my work when I went to do the MA at UEA. Excuse me. And I it's really interesting in that the protagonist of my novel was there, the storyline was there, but there was something missing, and I was falling out of love with it, really, because it was so torturous to write. And it was only when I was so the character of Nan, who is the character who has dementia, she was a really late addition to this book, but she became super important to it and really vital to the storyline as well. But she only really appeared in the last draft, so it's probably draft 7, and in the last kind of 6 months of writing. So it's quite interesting that you know, she was so vital. I decided to write what I know, and because I just finished doing this book with Wendy, I decided to insert this character. So, and she just became so important. And so I mean, it's difficult for me to explain much about this book because it is a mystery in some ways, so I can't give away the twist. But I'll just read you a little section, which is when the main protagonist, Chloe, visits Nan in the care home. And so it was really interesting to me to hear many of you talking about care homes. So this is my go at the care home setting. Everyone at Park House has lost something. For some, it's an item of jewellery. One lady, 3 doors down from Nan, has been searching for months for a pearl necklace she last wore in 1947. Chloe watches her sometimes, rifling through magazines and boxes of backgammon with torn corners, or down the backs of sofas, gathering nothing but crumbs under her fingernails. The other residents are used to her. They sweep their feet out of the way or pick up their cups of tea and knitting without breaking conversation. She mutters to herself while she's searching, telling tales of the time she wore it to no one in particular, taking herself all the way back to those pre-war dance halls and their parquet floors, and never catching sight of the beads. It's an unwritten rule in the care home that everyone exists in their own time frame. Some residents sit alongside each other, separated by decades, each as real to them as the year their neighbour finds themselves occupying in the seat next door. Another thing people lose is time. That's very common. Yesterday, Chloe was making a cup of tea for Nan when a man started talking about politics. He was furious about something, gesticulating wildly, so much so that one of the nurses asked him to keep his voice down. Well, of course, he said, it's all the Prime Minister's fault. It's all down to Edward Heath, he protested, in case he could persuade the nurse that the ex-PM himself was the reason residents were struggling to hear Countdown. Nobody corrected him. Time is mostly misplaced, which often makes the communal area one big waiting room for news, for a visit, for a loved one to return from a war that ended more than half a century ago. And that is the most painful thing that people lose, family. This morning, Chloe heard one lady ask at least a dozen times where her husband was, the nursing staff gently reminding her he had died 5 months before, and every explanation wet her cheeks with fresh tears. Terrible for these old folk, Nan says suddenly, looking round from their game of rummy. She leans in closer, so that some of them are a bit. Her fingers draw circles at the side of her ear until she's sure Chloe understands. Chloe nods. She is the cleaner today. It's marvellous that they let you have a little break now and then, Nan smiles. She's wearing a cerise pink blouse that Chloe doesn't recognise. That's a nice colour on you, Nan, Chloe tells her. It's not mine, it's Edna's. She lent it to me because I haven't got any clothes of my own here. I must have left them in my old house. This happened the other day when Nan couldn't see the fitted cupboard doors in her room. She'd been wearing the same clothes for 3 days before anyone thought to show her the clothes hanging neatly inside her wardrobe. In the end, one of the care assistants took a photograph of them and stuck it on the outside. Do you have a photograph stuck on your wardrobe door anymore, Nan? Do you? Chloe sighs. Nothing. Chloe also knows that we all have reasons for ignoring the truth sometimes, when a story we tell ourselves or others sounds better.
Oh, thank you for that. That's a lovely image as well of her giving up on that question at the end, I think. The thing that I was struck with by this little piece is that idea that everyone's living in their own world. And I mean, to some extent, that's true for all of us. But that idea that, the world kind of contracts down to one person is really interesting, and that they're kind of moving in bubbles. I really recognize that from my own family members, and when they're all together, how they intersect is interesting. That idea that they're not competing with each other. Did you feel like you had to story? I suppose it was just her part of the story.
Oh, sorry, I just missed the end because you broke up a little.
Sorry, my connection isn't playing along tonight. Did you feel like you had to almost map it for us, what was happening, all these different worlds?
I just think, like you said, we all actually do inhabit our own worlds. I mean, we kind of, it's kind of obvious in the dementia, in a care home, for example, like when I said that people are inhabiting different decades, even though they're sitting alongside each other. But I think that this is how we all operate in the world. So I don't think this is a dementia thing. Like you said, this is why I have a little problem with the term unreliable narrator, because I think we're all unreliable narrators, because we're all narrating our lives or our stories or our anecdotes of what happened, through our own particular lens. And I think that it's something that, we kind of accuse people who are living with dementia of perhaps being unreliable, or, we're not sure of the story they're telling. Like Sarah was saying, is this something that this guy saw on TV, or did this happen to him? But kind of, that's how we all are. We just all so invested in our own truth that we fail to admit that. I think it's only people who have experience of those with dementia that see it, really.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to broaden out the conversation, because I wonder if you can all speak to the idea of speaking from that voice, whether you felt, is it no different than writing another character? In some way, you're writing fiction, or even in poetry, if you're reading an narrative poem, we're speaking from the experience of someone. how is it different? You know, how is this different for you, taking that on? I know, Sarah, let's start with you because you're the last, you've been the longest silent. Were you worried about doing that? Did you feel like you could do it?
I was, because I think the thing that was different about this is, so if you're writing a novel and you're kind of taking on other people's voices, you don't necessarily then have to go back to the person whose voice you're basing it on and present the work back to them and say, so what do you think before I put this out into the world? So there is a difference, I think, when you are working sort of in a community setting like that, and part of the process is showing the work back to the people who have inspired it. You know, when I kind of went back to Ron's sister and said, you know, this is how I formatted it. What do you think? Do I need to take things out? Do I need to change things? You know, who holds that editorial responsibility makes this project kind of maybe slightly different to just kind of creating your work and then kind of putting it out into the world and not having to sit down and have a cup of tea with your readers in the same way. So it's kind of something I've gone on to think about in terms of how do you create work which is collaborative, but also is something that you actually have to physically kind of sit down and share, because I think that creates a very different sort of responsibility, and it puts a different pressure on you as the practitioner as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me is what you said, Sarah, about the staff, and then we'll come to the other characters in all of our stories in a minute. But, you know, the staff saying, please tell those stories. But one of the things I guess that's different here is that if it's a nonfiction piece, the individuals living with it are never going to be able to tell their stories. You know, you're never going to come back out the other end. In a refugee circumstance, for example, in my own circumstance, or someone living through a traumatic experience, they may come through the other end of it. And as you say, you can go back and check, or check others like them. But in this circumstance, people don't recover. So it's very hard to check necessarily that was the experience of someone, I guess. That would be my worry, but equally, you want the stories told. So Anna, you're waving. Yeah.
Just wanted to mention, because obviously with Wendy, when we're writing her books together, then it's a real collaboration, and she's a huge part of that. And so I will ask her to write something, you know, of her on a particular subject, and then she'll email it to me, and then I will edit, or we'll have a chat on WhatsApp, and then I'll put some of the things that she said back into it, and then it goes back and forwards like that. You know, and the other thing that I found with Wendy when I was writing her first book with her, that her memory wasn't always accurate, and we would go over the same things many times, but I didn't see that as a negative thing, because it coloured in the picture more and more and more. There weren't really discrepancies so much as just layers, and what Wendy found was that she would wake up in the night and write little post-it notes to herself, and then she would show me them in the morning and say, does this mean anything to you? And it was something that she'd kind of scrawled in nighttime writing. And I say, yeah, we were talking about that yesterday. So it was really lovely that her brain was returning memories to her. Mm. So the next day we could colour in a picture a little bit more.
And that's such a writerly thing to do for all of us. I don't know about you, but I have endless notes on my phone, and I wake up in the morning and think, I thought that was a really interesting thing in the middle of the night, and I either don't know what it is, or, you know, so it's nice to hear that goes right across the board. But yeah, I think the lovely thing for you is to constantly be in dialogue with her, and being able to kind of fill in the bits that maybe she's not able to fill in because you've had an earlier conversation. Mm. What I'm curious about is when the people were writing about Lou's speech, or Niamh, that's one of the things I really noted about your story, your family story. I noticed it's getting dark where you are, but we can still just see you. You know, that idea that the speech diminishes, and how you present someone living in that circumstance. You still manage it in this story with the laughter and the song. So can maybe speak to that a bit, about how you tackled that, or if you chose that moment in her life to tell the story when she wasn't able to speak. Yeah.
This is performative, you know, where I am right now, it's getting darker.
Yeah.
I apologize for that. It wasn't intentional. There's no light here. But it is an interesting link to what we're talking about. In terms of, we were talking about the point of view, I find that really interesting. It never occurred to me to write my story in the point of view of the mother, the woman who's suffering from dementia, because for me the whole point is recognizing that I can no longer access that, and that's okay. You know, that there's other ways to communicate with your loved ones or with people you know, without having to be in their heads. So I very specifically wrote it. Well, in this particular story, it's written in the third person point of view, but any other work I have written that deals with the subject is either in first person carer point of view or third person, because there's a mystery about, for me, there's a beautiful mystery and grace about watching a human being retreat from you in terms of language capabilities and those recognized communication lines, because it highlights the fact that we're still connected. That in my own personal life, I was no longer able to speak to my father, but I was never more connected with him. And I felt grateful to be given that opportunity to recognize that and to spend those silent moments with him, as we all did in our family, just spend those silent moments sitting together and breathing the same air and, you know, making the odd comment, usually about, you know, the weather or the sounds outside or something, just to remind each other that we're still there. So there is something very beautiful and mysterious about that, which really inspired me, and just reminding us of all the connections we have together that go beyond language and beyond the intellect.
Yeah, that makes me think of something I was told when a family member was living with dementia, that to be reminded that actually often those individuals are okay. It's us that feels concerned about it, because we're the ones that are really aware of what we feel was lost. But actually,
that's really true. I think you've really hit on something there, Marjorie, because I don't remember seeing any, apart from the first year or two when he was aware of what was happening to him, was very intellectually aware of it. Once he passed that threshold, thankfully, I never felt like my father suffered in that sense of like, oh, you know, I'm no longer me and I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know who I am. I saw peace for the most part, and then joy in like tiny little things, like for instance the bird song, or looking, you know, very carefully at the egg cup or whatever, and finding, and it wasn't a regression to childhood kind of a thing, because it was something more, you know, mysterious than that. I don't know what it was that I was witnessing, but I felt like, you know, it was maybe just a moment for me anyway. It gave me a moment anytime I was with my dad to reflect on what we normally rely on in terms of communication with each other, and how maybe unnecessary that is, and that just the simple things and non-linguistic things can be really, really meaningful and deep.
I think that's one of the things I scribbled on your
I've lost Marjorie. I've lost. I can't hear you.
Basics, but much more than what you can see. You can't hear me at all? Am I back?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. I was going to say, I want to ask you, Linda, because I know you've had both experiences of that in your family. So to speak to that, because I know the last piece you read was about someone who was, your father was frustrated by that experience.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, the discussion to me, because I had experience of both. And people used to say to me about my dad, oh, how lucky you are that when sometimes you go to see him, he knows you. And I used to think that it was the most awful thing, because I remember once going into my dad and he said to me, the world is torn asunder. And, you know, I remember those words to him, and he was because his life at that time of being lucid in his dementia was awful to him. And as his illness gradually progressed, he became less lucid. So it became a lot easier then to visit him. And he had that acceptance that he didn't recognize us. But like I said, for my aunt, it was the total opposite. So it was a lot easier for us as visitors and carers and members of her family to recognize the fact that it didn't matter to her, and she was happy in her real ignorance of her own condition. So I would say that it's a blessing in some ways and a curse in other ways. And certainly for my dad, there were a lot of moments of a lot of sadness with my dad, for the simple reason that sometimes when we left him, we knew that we were leaving him in a state of mind where he recognized his own condition, and that was very sad. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I guess if he's, moving away from that idea that he was aware, and assuming that lots of the characters we're writing about aren't, I want to talk a little bit about all the other people in the room, as it were, the carers, the family. And one of the questions I was thinking is, why do we do this writing? Apart from telling the stories that we all tell about our lives and the people around us, what's the purpose of this writing? And is it, as Sarah was talking about, advocacy, so that we can try and warn, help others feel empathy? I mean, what are we setting out to do? And I'd love for any of you to speak to that idea of whose stories we're trying to tell here, if it's not just those living with dementia. I don't know, Niamh, for example, your story was really about, for me, the son, and his tactics, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah. It for me, it was about capturing those moments to make sure that they don't disappear. Capturing those moments, those kind of epiphanies, and those moments of glad grace, where we rose above the sadness of it all, and the constant reminders of daily loss, and just capture those moments where you transcend all that, and either through laughter or through something kind of more mysterious. That was why I wrote the piece I wrote, and hoping that for other people who've experienced this, and even people who haven't experienced it, that they can, see their own experience reflected in that, or maybe understand dementia better by reading it.
Yeah. Sarah, I know you were talking a bit about the carers as well, and trying to advocate for them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't kind of want to make myself out to be kind of, a kind of advocacy saint, because I think it is really, that point was kind of I think it was really important, and it was one of the most important things. But I think just purely from a writerly perspective, it was interesting, and I think that, we write about this the same reason we write about anything else, because it was weird, and it was and it was dark, and it was kind of all of the things that you want from art or literature, and I wanted to engage with those subjects as a writer as well. And I think you have to be interested in people, and you have to have a belief in the value of people and the things that they have to say. You just have to kind of think people are interesting to kind of do this kind of work. And that's kind of part of the attraction, that you think people are great and people are interesting. And so those things come together, that it's about the attraction of this just as a subject matter, and the different aspects of it, and the kind of advocacy stuff as well becomes just very important, because you are dealing with real people. So I don't think you can necessarily divide those two things. And certainly the care staff that I worked with were initially quite suspicious or kind of openly hostile. In some cases, one woman wanted to know how much I was getting paid, which was clearly more than her, actually, and when did I have my lunch break and how long did I get, which were all valid questions, right? This kind of sort of complete stranger comes in and says, right, I'm going to observe you every day, but and then I'm going to write about it, and they were sort of a bit like, well, why, and where is this going to go? So there's quite a lot of work. We were talking in the panel I was chairing earlier this afternoon about kind of actually convincing people of the value of what it is that you're doing sometimes when you kind of go into these settings. And there was certainly quite a lot of that, and a lot of having to build and win trust before I could then kind of go back and sort of say, all right, this is what I've done. So I think once I had sort of sold it to the staff as storytelling, then they were much more open, and they kind of understood what it was I might be trying to do. That for me to kind of go and say, well, actually, I'm really interested in what the metaphor of stuffed bears is kind of sitting in here and how that represents, that wasn't going to kind of fly. But if I said, actually, I'm just here and I want to hear your stories and help you tell them, that opened something up, and that meant that we could work together much more effectively.
Yeah, and quite often the care homes are, because we, as an organisation, Open Book works in a lot of care homes too. They're almost closed shops, and so
I mean, literally, people were locked onto the wards. This was an end of life unit. Kind of they couldn't leave the 2 corridors on which they lived, and the staff couldn't get in or out, kind of unless they had the right security pass. So
yeah, and I mean, we work in prisons a lot too, and there's a lot of similarities in terms of those stories not making it out into the world, and us and not remembering that people are there. So I think that must be part of the work. We have a couple of questions, so I'm going to ask them out. I'll ask the first, which is, I'm going to ask you, Anna, because I found your piece to be funny in bits, which was a surprise to me, and that raises that question of, should I be laughing at this? The first question is, in finding moments of humor and stillness, does it help capture some of the essence of the human connection that still exists?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think both in nonfiction and in fiction, and just generally as humans, that's how we communicate. A lot of us, I mean, even in the most tragic situations. I remember when my stepfather was on a intensive care unit where he sadly died. We managed to find some things to kind of laugh about, and I remember there was a sign on the fridge that said, "Can everybody please remember that Dairy Crest deliver the milk on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and so-and-so delivers it on a Tuesday and Thursday, and so-and-so's milk is in here, and that's their name on it," and blah, blah. And then you kind of look around at all these people on ventilators and think, guys, it's milk. Look at these people. And I remember me and my brother finding that really, hilarious, even though we were in this desperate situation that 2 days before we hadn't expected to be in. And so I think that, I put some humour into my fiction, and that there's a really sweet conversation between Nan and Chloe that they're kind of just talking on 2 different levels, and it makes me laugh every time I read it, actually. But I know also with in the non-fiction work that I do with Wendy, I know humour is incredibly important to her because it's part of her character. So if she lets go of that, then she's letting go of another part of her character. And I chaired a panel this afternoon, and I had Ian Millenia, another writer on there whose grandfather died of dementia. But he said, the moments where his grandfather's humour rose to the surface were really heartwarming moments, because he was a funny man, and so those moments that he could still be funny delivered him back to the family. So I think humour's incredibly important, definitely.
I think, if I can come in, I think it is incredibly important as well. I remember one instance when we were visiting my dad, and this was an EMI unit, so it was quite a serious situation. But they had a music event going along. And when my sister and I walked in the middle of the room with everybody spread around the outside, as they normally are, there was a set of false teeth lying on the floor in the middle of the room. Now, I don't know whether they popped out when somebody was singing or what, but it relieves something in you, maybe not for the residents, but certainly for the family. I think it's important to have humour, because humour is part of all our lives, and it's a relief for no matter whether you're talking about dementia or not. So, I agree. I think it's very important.
And even those moments where the person who's living with dementia isn't in on it, some of the things they say are funny, and as a family member, I remember, my granny asking her own daughter who she was, and asking why this old woman was in the room with her, because she was convinced she was much younger than her. And as the family, we enjoyed that in the sense of thinking, well, at least we can see that it's funny that she thinks her, because she was always a woman who was wanted to be young at heart, so we were glad that she'd gone back to being 30 or whatever. But I think those moments are important for everybody else too, whether everybody can be part of it or not. A question for the poets. Do you think there's something in the poetic form that helps express or explore dementia, which prose finds it harder to do?
For me, with my poems, the answer is definitely yes. I think, well, it's for others to judge, but I do think that I managed to portray different emotions through my poetry, or allow myself to give different emotions through my poetry than I ever did with my fictional writing. So yeah, I think it's a very important aspect of poetry. It's not to say that you can't do it in prose writing. For me personally, I only started writing poetry when my 3 family members died. So it meant that I had to wait until that happened, and then maybe allowed myself to be more emotional and more personal about it.
Yeah. What was that? Why did you know that you were waiting? I'm just curious. I mean, did you know you were waiting for that to happen, or did you suddenly think, now I can do this?
I didn't think I realized. I thought I would probably write more prose about dementia, because when my aunt was in the home, we kept a diary for 2 years every day. And when you were talking there about the staff and so on, the staff in the home were absolutely wonderful. But there were days where, in a daily diary, we wrote down the things that perhaps should have been done with my aunt during the night and so on. So I had that in mind, that when she died, that I would follow it up with some kind of book, about that. And in the end, I didn't write the book in a factual sense. I started writing the poetry. I don't know why the transition went to the poetry, but it did.
Okay. Sarah, how about you?
I was just going to say, I think the thing about poetry is that it gives you a bigger toolkit. So that you can push language in ways kind of visually and sort of orally, hourly, potentially if you're kind of creating stuff for performance in ways that you can't necessarily push sentences. And kind of prose, can produce other effects. It can produce duration, it can produce kind of, you can do different things with syntax, but just kind of quite simply, there's some kind of really white pages in this book, because actually silence was something that I felt needed to be represented quite a lot. And you can just you can generate slightly different effects. And I think what I felt that poetry was useful for me was that it could capture the physicality of a lot of what I was seeing in a way that maybe prose couldn't. I could kind of put things in all caps and kind of make them kind of big and bold, and I could move the words around on the page, and I could create space. It was more constructed. It was more language can be more material when it's presented through poetic techniques sometimes, I think. And that materiality, that kind of physicality, that kind of dirtiness, that sense of the body was something that was very present in the experience that I was having. So I wanted that materiality in the text. So if poetry has a head start, it's just that you can kind of push a different set of buttons, I think.
And for me as well, listening to the 2 poets, the one poem after another, you're allowed to switch narratives, in a way that just doesn't, I assume doesn't work as well in fiction unless you're telling very short stories. So that way of giving, you can hit something really hard and then move on, and turn the reader's head in a different way, which just doesn't always work that way. But Anna, maybe it does.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that Wendy writes a lot of poetry, so she finds it really a great way of capturing those thoughts. And she also reads a lot of poetry now, because obviously she can't really follow the storyline of a novel. And she kind of went from, she was a big reader, then she went from novels to short stories, and now she enjoys poetry because she likes reading. So she wants to find a way to continue reading. So I think it's really interesting to hear from the poets about how, that form is useful to them. But I think that perhaps it's also useful to those living with dementia to capture thoughts, and that even if those thoughts are quite fragmented, poetry kind of lends itself to that, and also to continue reading as well.
Well, can I make a plug for Jan's work, the postcard stories? I don't know if I'm allowed to, but I'm going to anyway. And it's the work we use almost always with those living with dementia in our groups, because the stories, if you don't know them, go and find them. They're all written on the back of a postcard and sent to friends. I don't know if anyone here's had a postcard. I haven't. Sarah's had one, lucky Sarah. And then they get published in books, and they're tiny little stories. But because they all fit on one page, it means that if you're reading them with someone living with dementia, there's enough in each story for you to talk about. There's enough gaps. I think of them as very poetic because there's lots of gaps and lots of questions and sort of quirky, interesting things happen that you have to decide for yourself. In the same way, I think that works with poetry a lot, what's actually happening in the story. And two people can have completely different ideas about what's happening, but also they fit on one page. So you can look down and remind yourself of the characters' names, or, it doesn't take long to catch up if you've already forgotten what you just read. Whereas with a longer piece of prose, it's really hard to do that. So that's the prose that we find. And in fact, it works better than almost poetry because it's really short and condensed, and but lots and lots there to talk about. Sarah, I just want to mention your teddy bear poem, because I think the other thing that it does is it lets us say things without saying them. So as you were talking about the teddy bears' voices, I was thinking, well, that's often the same. It sounded to me like the voice of someone who's visiting someone, a loved one or a family member might have said a lot of the same things those teddy bears would say. I don't know if you had that in mind, but that it felt like you got to say that in a way that you might not in fiction or in prose.
Yeah, I think you can be, I don't know, poetry lends itself to kind of little snapshots of surreality as well. Maybe you can make things very weird for a moment, and there are often lots of very tiny weird moments in a care setting, and so that you can kind of produce those effects and then dial them down again. That's it, I think, kind of, as you say, when you're not trying to create a continuous narrative, you can dial up and dial down certain effects as you work your way through a text. So.
And that feels like it works very well for the lives of those living with dementia, because I suspect, well, having lived with them before, family members, that is how life works. Sometimes things are really ordinary. Really are. Jan wants to read us out or say something just now, but I want to take a moment to thank you all for your beautiful readings and your comments. I think I'm back now, so I'll just thank you again for your beautiful readings and comments and around the subject. Can I encourage you all to go and find the work of these wonderful authors, Linda, Anna, Sarah, and Neve. But I think that's all for us, because we've only got a couple of minutes, so it's only for me to say thank you and goodbye. Thanks for listening and being part of our audience tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to
So that's a wrap for Dementia Fiction Festival for this year. Thank you so much for joining us for the last 2 days. We have thoroughly enjoyed your company, and we have especially appreciated all of the amazing conversations, the fantastic presentations, the readings, the questions. There's been so much to think about. We're going to be picking through all of this for a long time to come. We hope you've enjoyed your time with us. If you missed any of the panels, they will all be available on the Dementia Fiction YouTube channel. You can have a look at them there. And we'd also like to thank especially the team here at Accidental Theatre, who've done an amazing job of hosting us and troubleshooting and looking after all of our tech needs for the last couple of days. Thanks again. We hope you'll keep in contact with us and share some of the projects and books you're working on and all of your ideas on the subject of dementia and writing. And we hope to meet you in real life at some stage soon. Thank you. Goodbye.